Today's story is a stark reminder as to why you should always read the fine print. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button asks you to edit one of their YouTube videos, agree to do it, but then just permanently delete their channel. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the morning of August 7th, 1981, a 34-year-old wildlife photographer named Carl McCunn stood on the edge of a lake in the Alaskan wilderness and chucked a box of ammunition into the water. The splash it made was surprisingly loud in the total silence that surrounded him. Carl was on the last day of a 5-month-long solo camping trip in a very remote area of northern Alaska that was actually inside the Arctic Circle. A plane had dropped him off here in early spring, and he had set up his tent by this lake, which was surrounded on all sides by forest and huge snowy mountains. And during this 5-month trip, Carl had not seen or spoken to another person the entire time. There were no phones, no roads, no rangers, no people around for at least 100 miles. I mean, this is true isolation. Carl looked up into the sky and listened carefully for the low roar of the plane that was supposed to pick him up today. But as he listened, he couldn't hear anything. But this didn't worry Carl, because he actually had only arranged for his pickup date, not the pickup time. So it was just at some point on this day he was going to get picked up. He didn't know exactly when. And so as he anxiously waited, he just kind of puttered around his campsite and continued to pack up his things. And as Carl did this, he remembered that the type of plane that was going to be picking him up today, it was his buddy Rory's plane, it was really small. And there was a chance that he couldn't actually fit all of his belongings on the plane. And so in anticipation of this, he had identified that he didn't need all of his ammo. And so that's why he was chucking his ammo into the lake, basically in preparation for pickup. Just then, a breeze kicked up, and so Carl zipped his parka up to his chin. This was actually the so-called warm season in the Arctic Circle, but warm in the Arctic Circle meant still near freezing temperatures at night. And as much as Carl loved being out in the wilderness, doing these solo camping trips out in the middle of nowhere, he really was excited to get back to his home in Anchorage, Alaska, and see his friends and call his dad and, be in a nice warm house for once. Carl was about to chuck his 6th and final box of ammunition into the lake when he heard the loud sound of a wolf howling on the other side of the lake. And it made him stop for a second, and he decided that, maybe until the plane gets here, I'll hold on to at least one box of ammunition. So he stuck this final box into his bag, he picked it up, and then he walked along the shoreline up to where he had rigged a net to catch some fish. And when he got to the net, he saw he had caught 2 trout. And so he scooped the fish out, he went back to his campsite, he made a fire, cooked the fish, and as he sat down to eat them, he just kept looking up to the sky and listening, hoping for this plane to arrive soon. When he was done eating, Carl made a quick entry into his diary, kind of detailing the last day at camp, and then he finished packing up all his stuff, and he brought it all down to the waterline, ready to be picked up, and then he sat on his trunk, again, just kind of waiting for his friend to show up. And by this time, it was about mid-afternoon, and still no sign of the plane. But nonetheless, Carl sat there kind of taking in the scene, this beautiful lake and nature. I mean, this is the last time he's going to be here, and so he's trying to appreciate it. After all, this had been a really successful photography trip. He had shot 500 rolls of film that he knew he could sell, and that would make enough money that he'd be able to do this again the following year. And so as Carl sat there, taking in the scene and daydreaming about next year's trip, he noticed the sun was beginning to set. And when he noticed this was kind of like the first time that Carl actually became worried. This far north, the sun stayed out for nearly 20 hours a day in the summer. And so if the sun was setting right now, that meant it had to be near midnight. And so his friend Rory, who was supposed to pick him up today, at some point today, well, now that we've hit midnight, Carl knew his friend had officially missed the date. And Carl had no way of contacting him to see what had happened or when he would be here. And so as dusk fell, and still there was no sign of Rory, Carl continued to get more and more anxious. And finally, he had to reset up his tent, and he crawled inside, got in a sleeping bag, and went to sleep praying that his friend would be there the next day. The next day, Carl got up early and packed up his stuff and waited by the shoreline for his friend. But all day he waited, and the plane still never came. Carl tried to convince himself that, maybe his friend got mixed up on the dates, or, maybe something came up that's delayed him a couple of days, but he'll be here. But then another day came and went, and then another, and still no plane. And it was around this time that Carl remembered something that made him feel sick to his stomach. On the night 6 months earlier, when he and Rory had discussed pickup plans, Carl remembered that night had been filled with drinking. I mean, these guys were just laughing and having a good time, and at some point, as the beers were flowing, Carl had asked Rory, "Hey, can you pick me up on August 7th at the end of my trip?" And Rory had said, "Yeah, I can probably do that." But Rory had also said that he would have to check his schedule first before he could 100% commit to this. And Carl, in his excitement about going on this trip and getting ready for it and all that, had just forgotten to follow up with Rory and make absolutely sure he could pick him up. And so now Carl was realizing that Rory wasn't delayed or mixed up about the dates. Rory wasn't coming. And Carl knew there was zero chance of another plane just happening to fly over the area and that plane picking him up. I mean, for the entire summer Carl had been out here, he had literally not seen any planes. His best hope was that his dad or maybe one of his friends would report him missing. But he knew that was unlikely, and it actually was his own doing. Carl traveled constantly and almost never told people where he was going or when he'd be back. And on one trip recently, Carl had gone out and missed his return date, and his dad had been concerned about him and so called the police. And when Carl had come back and realized what his dad did, he told his dad to never do that again. "Never contact authorities if I'm late. I'm fine." And all of this meant now Carl was going to face a brutal Alaskan winter all by himself with limited supplies and only a single box of ammunition. Hey, it's MrBallen here, and I am so excited to tell you all about a brand new podcast from Ballen Studios called Redacted: Declassified Mysteries, hosted by the incredible Luke LaManna. From covert government experiments to bizarre assassination attempts, Redacted dives deep into the astonishing true stories of uncovered secrets, lies, and deception within the world's most powerful institutions. Governments and military services around the globe have always cloaked themselves in secrecy. But history shows that when you try too hard to hide something, it only makes people more curious. Luke and his team have spent months researching these totally true and thoroughly twisted tales, guaranteed to keep you on the edge of your seat. Stories like the mind-bending truth behind Operation Paperclip, where former Nazi scientists were smuggled into America to advance US technology and intelligence during the Cold War. Or the shocking story of Charles Manson and the CIA, revealing how a notorious cult leader might have been entangled in a web of covert operations. Trust me when I tell you, the stories are real and the secrets are shocking. Follow Redacted: Declassified Mysteries with Luke LaManna on the Wondery app, or wherever else you get your podcasts. You can listen ad-free right now by joining Wondery Plus in the Wondery app or on Spotify. A few weeks later, at the end of August, Carl was still stuck out in the Alaskan wilderness. By now, Carl had fully accepted that Rory was not going to come pick him up, and Carl was doing his best not to fixate on his stupid mistake. He figured he had two choices. The first one was that he could just stay put and hope to be rescued. This was the conservative option. He knew how to get food and also firewood near his campsite, so he wouldn't starve to death and he wouldn't freeze. But this would only keep him alive. This would not actually get him rescued. The other choice was that Carl could pack up his campsite and attempt to basically hike out of here 75 miles to the nearest city, called Fort Yukon. Now, this could get him home, but with it came a much higher chance of death. If Carl did the hike, well, those 75 miles would be over extremely rough terrain with absolutely zero human-made trails. And so one little slip up and he could fall and get hurt or get lost. And also finding food was sort of a toss-up, and the weather at best would be brutal and at worst would be fatal. Plus, the entire region those 75 miles were in was absolutely teeming with wolves. Carl knew both of these choices were bad, but he was running out of time to make a decision. The brutal Arctic winter was fast approaching, and if Carl was going to attempt this horrible hike, he would really have to do it soon. And so as Carl thought about what he was going to do, he trudged his way over to one of his rabbit snares, and he was so happy to see he had caught a rabbit. And so he took the rabbit back to his camp and he cooked it over the fire. And as he's eating it, he's thinking, you know what, this isn't so bad. I caught food for now. I mean, this will keep me alive at least for a couple of days. You know, maybe I should just stay here. But deep down, he knew the staying put option was not a real option. I mean, even though, yes, by staying here, he could keep himself from starving, you know, he knew how to get food and all that, well, he'd still be a sitting duck for all the predators in the area, and there were many, and remember, he only has one box of ammunition. But just then, Carl heard the most glorious sound, the distant whine of a small plane engine. At first, he thought he must be hearing things. Remember, he has not seen a plane at all since he got here. But sure enough, he looked up into the sky, and a second later, he saw a plane flying directly towards his camp, low and slow. Carl ran in his tent and grabbed the most brightly colored thing he could find, his sleeping bag, which was bright orange. He ran outside of his tent and began waving it back and forth to get the pilot's attention. Carl saw the plane belonged to the Alaska State Troopers, and so he figured his friends must have reported him missing, and now the police were out to rescue him. A moment later, the plane passed directly over Carl's camp, so low to the ground that Carl could actually see the pilot looking back at him. Carl looked right at the pilot's eyes, and when Carl was nearly certain he had just made eye contact with the pilot, he threw his fist up in the air in excitement and jumped up and down. He couldn't believe it. He was saved. The pilot was going to land and take him home. With a big grin on his face, Carl watched as this plane, sure enough, made a big U-turn. And then Carl watched the plane make another pass over the camp, low and slow, which Carl figured meant, you know, the pilot was looking for a place to land. And so as the pilot was doing that, Carl rushed to his campsite and began packing everything up. And as he did, he's kind of keeping an eye out, watching the plane, looking for it to land. But it didn't. The plane just kept on flying straight away from Carl's campsite until it disappeared over the horizon. For the rest of the day, Carl just stared off into the distance, hoping for this plane to come back. But it didn't. Lying inside his tent that night, Carl couldn't sleep. He was so shaken up by what had happened that day. He didn't understand, you know, he saw the pilot. The pilot seemed like they were looking back at him. Why didn't they land? Why didn't they stop? Carl told himself that, you know, maybe the terrain was too rough and there was no way for the pilot to land. You know, that was possible. And so perhaps this pilot was flying back and getting another plane, maybe a float plane to land on the water. Carl didn't know, but he felt like that could be a possibility, and it sort of made him feel a little bit better. But he still couldn't relax enough to sleep. And so, knowing he was just going to lay there all night, he sat up, turned on his flashlight, and began looking for something to read, just to occupy his mind. Now, at this point, Carl has been out in the wilderness all alone for months and months, and he's been stranded for weeks. He has read all of his books and all of his magazines like 1,000,000 times. He's even read his diary a dozen times. I mean, he's read everything. And so as he was looking around his tent, he was looking for literally anything else to read. And suddenly, he found something. His hunting license. It was like the one thing he had not closely read. Not an exciting thing to read, but new. It was just a little paper certificate with some rules and regulations and safety tips about hunting. And so Carl just began reading the front, and he read it all the way down, and then he flipped it over and he continued reading, but then he saw something that made his heart practically stop. At first he thought maybe he misunderstood, but no, he read it over and over again, and it was very clear. And so Carl looked up in shock. He suddenly understood why that pilot had left him. For weeks, Carl stayed close to his camp, just hoping and praying that somehow, some way, that plane would still come back. But it never did. And by the time Carl had actually accepted this fact that really the plane's not coming back, well, by that point, it was too late to try to hike out. So all he could do was stay put. However, the lake had frozen over, so he couldn't fish. His snares all sat empty because all the wolves and foxes got to his catches before he could. By October, Carl was getting really skinny. By November, Carl was genuinely starving. On November 26th, Thanksgiving Day, Carl laid inside of his tent and made a diary entry. There would be no Thanksgiving feast for him today. His food stores were totally gone, and the Arctic winter was getting so bad. In fact, his fingers and toes were turning black from frostbite. And he was sick all the time and constantly had chills. And as Carl wrote in his diary, he looked out the tent flap at his dying fire, knowing he had no more firewood. He knew he only had one choice left to make. He scratched a final sentence into his diary. He wrote, "They say it doesn't hurt." Then he set his diary on the floor of the tent near his rolls of film. Then he reached for his rifle, and his last box of ammo. A little while later, a single shot rang out across the lake. A couple months later, in early February of 1982, Alaska State Troopers would find Carl. Carl was deceased. He had taken his own life. What Carl had only realized later was that when he made that fist pump, when he was so excited when that pilot had flown overhead and he thought he was going to get rescued, well, that fist pump had sealed his fate. Because, like it said on Carl's hunting license, a single arm raised in the air is the universally recognized body sign for all okay, do not wait. And so when that Alaska State Trooper pilot flew over Carl's camp, he did make eye contact with Carl. He saw him, but he also saw Carl raising his fist in the air and thought he was okay, and so he turned around and he left. If Carl had only read that hunting license a little bit sooner, he would have known to have raised 2 hands in the air as the pilot flew over for the universal sign that means, pick me up. And now, here is a clip from the latest episode of Redacted. Enjoy.
On May 2nd, 1945, a U.S. Army private stood guard at the base of a remote mountain in Austria. He was still riding high from the news he'd heard on the radio recently. German leader Adolf Hitler had committed suicide. The soldier knew it was just a matter of time until World War II was over and he could go back home to America. Just then, he noticed someone barreling down the mountain on a bicycle. The soldier realized it was a young man with blonde hair and civilian clothes, but he couldn't tell if the man was friend or foe. He pointed his gun at the man as he hurtled toward him. He wasn't about to risk anything in the last days of the war. He ordered the man to drop his bike and put up his hands. The man did as he was told. Then, in broken English, he said he was one of hundreds of scientists that worked for the Nazi regime who had gone into hiding because Nazi leadership had ordered them to be executed. The man said the Nazis would rather kill them than risk them being captured by the Allies and revealing their knowledge of Hitler's secret weapons. The man insisted the scientists wanted to surrender to the Americans. And not only that, they wanted to help the Americans by sharing with them the secrets of the Nazis' deadly new missile, the V-2 rocket. The soldier looked the man up and down, taking in his fancy gray leather overcoat. He was making a very bold claim, and the soldier couldn't tell if he was lying. He was a Nazi, after all. But if what the man said was true, it could potentially change the future of the world.
Today's story is yet another reminder that the woods, especially at night, are not a safe place. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please purchase a huge billboard that's located right across the street from the Like Button's house, and every month put on it a new spoiler for one of the Like Button's favorite TV shows, movies, or video games. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of December 6, 1997, a man named Yuri Trush drew his rifle and crept silently through a remote forest in eastern Russia as he and his team of 3 other armed men and his dog followed this trail of pink snow. All of the men and the dog were on very high alert because they knew someone or something was out in these woods watching them. After walking for a while, Yuri and his crew spotted a small cabin up ahead in this clearing. This cabin, they knew, belonged to a guy named Vladimir Markov, who was a hunter who had gone missing recently, and that was actually why Yuri and his crew were out here. They were searching for Vladimir. But as Yuri and his crew got closer to this cabin, Yuri couldn't help but feel really terrified. Yuri was a 47-year-old big-time weightlifter and ex-military guy who was also a seasoned hunter. I mean, this is a tough, strong guy. But as he walked up on Vladimir's cabin, it was super obvious that something horrible and violent had happened here. All around the scene was pieces of broken furniture. There was a ceramic sink that was shattered outside and the pieces were everywhere. There was a bunch of beehive boxes that had been badly damaged. There was the shed that clearly had been ripped to pieces. And also all over the area outside of this cabin was blood. And this pink trail of snow, this blood trail they were following, led right up to the front door of this cabin, where there was also a big streak of blood on the front door. Now, even though Yuri was scared to go any further, he knew he was in charge and he had to go and look inside that cabin to see if maybe Vladimir was there. And so Yuri walked into the bloody clearing. He made his way up to the front door of the cabin, and with his crew right behind him on the porch, he used his rifle and pushed the door inward. Now, at first, Yuri didn't see anything inside the cabin because his eyes hadn't adjusted and there were no windows, so no light was coming into the cabin. But after a second of Yuri kind of standing in the doorway with his rifle to make sure there was no threat inside the cabin, his eyes adjusted and he realized Vladimir was not in there, and in fact, the cabin looked abandoned. So Yuri stepped inside and he looked around, and immediately he noticed all the walls inside this cabin were covered in these deep gouges and scratches. And then he looked on the ground and he found more wrecked furniture and lots more blood. But in a weird way, this actually gave Yuri some hope that maybe Vladimir was alive. He might be badly hurt, but if he's not here, he must be somewhere. And so Yuri turned around and he walked out of the cabin, and right as he stepped onto the snow with his men and his dog right behind him, 3 things happened practically all at once. The first thing was Yuri's dog began whining uncontrollably and running in circles. And number 2, there were all these crows in the trees nearby that just all at once suddenly flew into the sky and disappeared. And the third thing was this unbelievably loud growling sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere really far away and also somewhere really close. It was like the forest itself was growling. 5 days earlier, on December 1st, the soon-to-be missing hunter, Vladimir Markov, decided to give up on another unsuccessful hunt, and he slung his rifle over his shoulders and he lit a cigarette under his big bushy mustache, and he and his 3 dogs turned around and began the slow walk back to their small cabin in the middle of the woods. Vladimir was really frustrated because he'd been staying in this cabin in the woods, away from his wife, away from his family, to try to hunt some game and bring some meat back, but so far he hadn't caught anything. But as Yuri and his 3 dogs kind of rounded a corner in this forest, he spotted something up ahead that was like an answer to his prayers. He saw there was a dead boar just lying out in the middle of the forest, and it was in this big pool of blood, and there was still steam coming off of the body, which meant this was a fresh kill. And so Vladimir raised his rifle in case whatever had killed this animal was nearby, but when he didn't see anything, he just went with his dogs over to the carcass and he pulled out a hatchet and he cut off 2 big haunches of meat from this boar. Now, Vladimir knew it was totally in bad form to steal another potential hunter's kill, although he didn't know if a hunter had killed this boar or if another animal had killed this boar, but he still felt bad about what he was doing. However, Vladimir was desperate. He didn't have any meat, and here it was, so he took the opportunity. After Vladimir had wrapped up this meat and put it in his bag, he and his 3 dogs jogged the last few miles back to the cabin, and when they got there, it was basically pitch black outside. Now, Vladimir was not scared of the forest at night, but he knew there were predators out here at night, so he needed to act quickly. So he rushed over to his small shed that was right outside of his cabin, and he put the boar meat inside, shut the door, and locked it, and then he turned to go into his cabin to retire for the night, but after taking only a couple of steps towards his cabin, he realized his 3 dogs had not followed him. And so he turned around, and he saw the 3 dogs were totally on edge, looking out beyond the shed where he had just put the meat. They were kind of looking out into the dark forest. Now remember, he's all alone in the middle of the woods here. It's nighttime, there's no visibility. And so Vladimir grabbed his flashlight and he shined it kind of roughly in the direction that the dogs were looking, like they had seen something. And he's shining his light, but all he sees are just dark trees and nothingness. There was nothing there. Vladimir did his best not to panic, but he couldn't help but feel like there was a predator nearby and his dogs had picked up on it, and so he just wanted to get inside the cabin and shut and lock the door as quickly as possible. And so he began backing up towards the door of his cabin while calling his dogs towards him, and 2 of the dogs followed. But a third dog just stayed where she was and continued to kind of whine and growl and look out away from the cabin in this direction that all the dogs were looking. But eventually, this dog just took off running into the forest. Vladimir, who loved his dogs, screamed and screamed for this dog to come back. But the dog didn't. And so Vladimir just stood there with his two dogs in front of his cabin door, listening to the bark of this third dog getting farther and farther away into the woods. And then suddenly, Vladimir heard his dog start to whimper. And then it was like the forest erupted with the loudest growl he had ever heard in his life. And then there was silence. Vladimir was horrified and just instinctively grabbed the two other dogs and stumbled into his cabin and shut and locked the door behind him. Now, Vladimir adored his three dogs. Those were his closest friends in the world, and all he wanted to do was run out there and save that third dog. But just based on how loud that growl was, he knew whatever was out there would kill him. And so this was a suicide mission if he went out there. And so he decided he would just stay put with the two dogs, and he just hoped that his third dog somehow survived its encounter with whatever was out there. If you're enjoying today's story, well, I have exciting news for you. My long-awaited very first book is out right now. It's called MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, and it's shipping worldwide right now. This graphic novel was truly a labor of love, but I can tell you it came out just beautiful, and I think you're going to love it as much as we do. It has 4 feature-length, brand new stories, one of which you're listening to right now, along with 5 OG classic MrBallen stories that have all been reformatted and re-edited to fit this book. If you want to purchase a copy of this bad boy, just go to book.ballenstudios.com, or you can go wherever books or audiobooks are sold. And speaking of audiobooks, if you enjoy hearing me tell you stories, well, guess what? There is an audiobook version of this. And I can tell you, when I recorded said audiobook, I got really into it and kind of, at times, went off script, kind of dramatically so. And so it winds up being this really cool accompanying piece to the graphic novel, but it's also a really unique standalone MrBallen piece. So it's like a really cool thing to get that is not just a regurgitation of what you read in the book. It's its own thing. Again, my first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. Go to book.ballenstudios.com or anywhere else books are sold to get your copy today. After sitting in his cabin for only a couple of minutes, kind of consoling his two other dogs, Vladimir heard more activity outside of his cabin. He heard what sounded like wood splintering and breaking. Now, there were no windows in Vladimir's cabin. However, he had drilled a couple of holes, very small holes, in each of the walls of the cabin so he could look out and use them as hunting blinds. And so Vladimir ran to the hole that looked out the front of his cabin towards where his shed was and where this wood breaking sound was coming from. And when he looked out through this hole, remember, it's the middle of the night, there's no lights outside, so he couldn't really see anything. But even in the darkness, when he looked kind of roughly in the direction of the shed where the boar meat was, he could clearly see this huge, shadowy creature moving around really violently, like its body was jerking in different directions. And it was obvious to Vlad that whatever this creature was, it was ripping his shed to pieces, breaking all the wood apart, probably to get in and get the boar meat. And that's when it dawned on Vladimir that whatever this creature was, it very likely was the creature that killed the boar that he stole, and now this creature was back to reclaim its meat. And so as Vladimir realized that, he just hoped that whatever this creature was, once it had its boar meat back, that it would just leave and not come after him. However, after this creature had totally decimated the shed, and so by default had clearly reached the boar meat inside, the creature didn't leave. It just sat down and stared in the direction of Vladimir and the cabin. And for several hours, Vladimir just continued to stare out this hunting blind hole at this shadow creature that was not moving. And after a while, Vladimir got tired. The creature wasn't moving. It's the middle of the night. He'd been really busy all day. And so at some point, Vladimir and his two dogs kind of dozed off. And when they woke up a couple hours later, when it was still dark outside, Vladimir looked out the hole again and he saw the creature was actually now gone. For a second, Vladimir was relieved. He's thinking, great, this thing's gone, I'm safe now. But just to make sure, he wanted to go to the other holes he had drilled in the walls of his cabin to look out in all 4 directions and make sure this creature really was gone. So he stood up and he walked over to one side, he looked out that hole, and all he saw was dark forest, nothing there. He walked to the other side of the cabin to another one of these holes, he looked out it, and again, just dark forest, no creature. Then he goes to the back of his cabin and looks out that hole, and this time, again, he does see just dark forest, but then suddenly something slammed into the wall that he's looking through, and then just as suddenly as this huge collision has happened, as Vladimir is kind of still looking out the hole, this massive yellow eye suddenly lowers down and looks right back through the hole right at Vladimir. It was the shadowy creature that had broken into the shed, and it had never left. And this creature, after quickly looking at Vladimir through the hole, it backed up a little bit, exposing its entire face to Vladimir. And Vladimir, who's so scared he can't move, he's just looking out the hole the whole time, he sees this enormous face with all this fur that's covered in blood. It's got these enormous teeth, and its mouth is open, and it's staring right at him like it wants to jump on him and kill him. And then this creature winds up and swipes at the hole and literally rips a bunch of wood off the side of the cabin. And reflexively, Vladimir just grabs his rifle, raises it, and fires a shot through the hole at this creature. And the creature whimpers, turns around, and runs off. Vladimir would stay up the rest of the night, anxiously looking through each of the holes around his cabin, just anticipating this horrible thing to come right back and try to attack him again. But eventually the sun came up and the creature did not come back, and so Vladimir was thinking, okay, now I'm safe. I can go outside and kind of figure out what's happened here and figure out my next move. And so Vladimir grabbed his dogs, he went to his door, he opened it up, he stepped outside and looked around, he didn't see anything. As a precaution, he fired his rifle into the air to scare off any animals that could be nearby. And when clearly, the creature wasn't here, there's nothing here, he's all alone, he stepped down onto the snow and he noticed these huge prints in the snow, which had to be from this shadowy creature that had tried to attack him. But now that it was daylight, Vladimir can look at these prints up close, and he knew what kind of creature this was. This was a Siberian tiger, and this was an enormous Siberian tiger. But that was not the most terrifying part of this discovery. Instead, it was what Vladimir saw these prints doing. These prints circled around the cabin over and over and over again, which meant the night before, after Vladimir fell asleep, this tiger had come up and basically begun stalking him and his 2 dogs. It must have known they were in the cabin. And then at some point, maybe the tiger saw Vladimir's eye inside of that little hole he was looking through, and the tiger tried to pounce. But Vladimir's thinking to himself, something's wrong with this Siberian tiger. While Siberian tigers are certainly dangerous to people, they are not known for actively hunting people. That's not something they do. But based on these prints, and just generally based on what Vladimir saw the night before, it seemed very likely that this Siberian tiger was actively stalking Vladimir. But even though Vladimir was totally terrified by this point, the only thought really going through his mind at this point was going out and trying to find his missing 3rd dog. He knew the chances of his dog still being alive were slim, but he had to go look. However, he knew he would need backup in case he ran into this Siberian tiger. So Vladimir put his 2 dogs on leashes, and then with them in hand, he began running towards his neighbor's house. It would take Vladimir and his dogs about 1 hour to run the 4 miles to his neighbor's cabin, and when he got there, he knocked, and his neighbor, whose name was Ivan, he opened the door, and Vladimir practically ran Ivan over, just trying to get inside of his cabin to safety. And then once Vladimir was inside and Ivan had shut the door and he's looking at Vladimir, and then Vladimir just kind of vomited out all the stuff that had happened over the past 12 to 24 hours. And at the end of telling Ivan the story, Vladimir asked him, "Would you please come with me to go find my dog?" And Ivan, he just stared at Vladimir and eventually just said, "No." And then, after a long, awkward silence, Ivan kind of backed up from Vladimir, like he didn't want to be near him. And then Ivan told Vladimir that Vladimir had been marked by the tiger, and now the only hope he had was getting as far as humanly possible away from this tiger, because that tiger is never going to stop, and it's going to eventually track you down and kill you. Vladimir felt totally let down, but he couldn't force Ivan to go with him, and so he said, okay, I understand. And then Vladimir left Ivan's cabin, he went back outside, and the instant he was back on the snow, one of his two dogs suddenly acted like they had heard something or seen something, and they took off running. Vladimir didn't have a chance to grab the dog's leash, and so he's watching as yet again one of his dogs is disappearing into the forest. Now, Vladimir did not chase after this second dog because he knew there was this Siberian tiger out there and he couldn't risk, running into it by himself. And so again, it totally pained him to watch his beloved dog vanish into danger, but he really couldn't do anything about it right then. And so instead, Vladimir spent the rest of this day going cabin to cabin all over this area, asking all his neighbors, please come with him to help him track down his dogs. But each of the people he spoke to just said no for the same reasons Ivan did. They said, Vlad, you have been marked by the tiger. I'm not going out there with you. And so finally, as darkness began to fall, Vladimir and his one remaining dog just gave up trying to get help, and they turned around and began walking back towards their cabin. It was nearly pitch black by the time Vladimir and his dog arrived at the cabin, and when they got there, even though he could barely see anything, Vladimir knew something was terribly wrong. Vladimir's outdoor sink, which sat right outside of his cabin, was broken to pieces, like something had smashed it. And then also all of his beekeeping boxes had been broken apart and there were obvious teeth marks all over it. Now, these two things had not happened when he had left that morning to try to go get help, which meant very likely the Siberian tiger had come back and done this damage and very likely was still in the area. And so all Vladimir is thinking is, I have to get in my cabin as fast as possible and shut and lock that door. And so Vladimir grabbed his last dog and very carefully he maneuvered his way through all the wreckage. He went up to his front door, and as he's about to open it up, he hears whimpering, and it sounds like one of his dogs who's gone missing, and the whimpering is coming from inside of his cabin. And so without any hesitation, Vladimir flung the door the rest of the way open, and he looked inside, and he couldn't see anything at first, but then he noticed there was this kind of pile of broken up furniture from the day before, and the whimpering appeared to be coming from underneath it. And so Vladimir rushed over and he began moving the furniture out of the way, and sure enough, underneath it, he finds one of his missing dogs who's been very badly hurt, but who is still alive and who is whimpering. And so Vladimir, he's so happy that one of his dogs is okay, and he grabs his dog. But unfortunately for Vladimir, this was a trap. Now, we don't know this for sure, but the leading theory is this Siberian tiger actually set this trap on purpose to catch Vladimir. It's believed that this tiger wounded the dog so the dog would begin to whimper, luring Vladimir out, at which point the tiger could pounce. 4 days later, that armed search party led by Yuri arrived at Vladimir's cabin. They found it destroyed with blood everywhere. They went inside, there was nothing there. They came back outside, and that's when Yuri's dog began running in circles and the crows flew into the air and they heard that deafening roar like the whole forest was roaring. Well, that was the sound of the Siberian tiger. Luckily, though, Yuri was not just some rugged outdoorsman. He was actually a member of something called the Inspection Tiger Unit, which basically is like a SWAT team that responds to tiger attacks. And so when Yuri heard this unbelievable roar, he just started walking straight towards it. But with every step Yuri and his team took into the forest, the roars coming from this tiger faded farther and farther away from them. But at the same time, Yuri began to notice on the ground little scraps of clothing. And so Yuri and his team, instead of trying to follow this roar, they just began following these bits of clothing. And these scraps eventually led them to a big clearing in the forest. And in this clearing were these two big red circles in the snow. And so Yuri and his men carefully approached these circles. And when they realized what was in them, they just stood there in silence. In the center of the left circle was a heap of Vladimir's clothing, and then underneath them were just bits and pieces of Vladimir, like he was ripped apart into different pieces and kind of piled up in this circle. And in the other circle, the right circle, was Vladimir's head, and it had been completely skinned. And after seeing this, Yuri and many other people have come to the conclusion that this Siberian tiger attacked Vladimir just for revenge. That this tiger felt like, Vladimir was encroaching on its territory, it stole its boar kill, and then also Vladimir had shot the tiger, wounding it, which only incited the tiger more. And so finally the tiger laid a trap and caught Vladimir and ripped him to pieces and then displayed him for the search party to find. Yuri and his team would eventually find and kill this Siberian tiger. But by this point, the tiger had actually managed to kill at least one other hunter, and very much in the same way it killed Vladimir, by luring this hunter into a trap, and then pouncing and killing, and ripping the hunter to pieces, and then displaying them, basically warning other hunters not to come in here. And while the death of this tiger certainly made Yuri and other people living in this area feel more safe, at the same time, Yuri has been told by other locals that unfortunately now, because of his brush with this tiger, he has been marked by the tiger, just like Vladimir. And so, according to legend, at some point, unless Yuri goes far, far away, he's going to be tracked down and killed by a tiger. Just a reminder, my very first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. We've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, come on, go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's story, be sure to check out our podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, that are available to listen to right now. But many of them on this podcast are only available on the podcast. They are not on YouTube. Again, that podcast is called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on Amazon Music. Today's video is about a medical mystery that ultimately gets solved when somebody uncovers some very unsettling security footage that we will play at the end of this video. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come over to your nice, calm backyard barbecue, but be sure to replace their hot dog with a lit stick of dynamite. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On May 27, 2022, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Chad Marsden stood inside of an operating room with a nurse, a surgeon, and their unconscious patient. Dr. Marsden worked at the Baylor Scott & White Surgicare Center in Dallas, Texas, and it was his job to make sure patients stayed asleep during surgery and then woke up safely afterward. That day, Dr. Marsden and his colleagues were wrapping up a routine liposuction procedure on a middle-aged woman. The surgeon had just finished stitching up the woman's incisions, and so Dr. Marsden, following protocol, began taking her slowly off of anesthesia to wake her back up again. And so Dr. Marsden turned off the anesthesia machine, which is this big rectangular device that takes the liquid anesthesia drugs and converts it into a vapor so it can be breathed in. And then Dr. Marsden removed the breathing mask from the woman's face. Then he changed her IV from an anesthetic drug mixture to regular saline. And so now that these drugs were not being pumped into her system, she would wake up over the next half hour or so. After that, Dr. Marsden and the nurse and the surgeon took their patient on the stretcher and they pushed her out of the OR into the hallway and began making their way down towards the recovery room. But as they were walking down this hallway, they bumped into more of their colleagues, another nurse and another anesthesiologist, and the hallway was tight enough that Dr. Marsden had to step aside to let these two pass. And then after they did, and they sort of waved at their colleagues, Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon continued walking, and as they did, Marsden happened to look down at their patient, and immediately he knew something was wrong. This woman's skin had turned completely gray. Dr. Marsden was totally caught off guard by this. He looked at her vital sign monitor and saw that her blood pressure, which just moments ago had been normal, was now dangerously high. And then, as he's staring at her monitor, her blood pressure plummeted. And then also her oxygen levels fell, and then she began foaming at the mouth. It was clear this woman was going into cardiac arrest, which meant if they didn't act quickly, her heart was going to stop. Now, Dr. Marsden, again, is sort of in shock at how quickly this is happening, but he just jumped into protocol. He began giving the woman chest compressions to make sure blood was flowing to her heart. Meanwhile, the surgeon administered oxygen and blood pressure medication, and the nurse called for an ambulance. The reason she had to call for an ambulance is because the Surgicare Center was not equipped to handle medical emergencies. It was only for scheduled surgeries. And so if there was a medical emergency, all they could do was just stabilize the patient until paramedics arrived. And that's exactly what Dr. Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon did. They got this woman stable, and then just a minute later, two paramedics came running down the hallway. They took possession of the patient, they put her onto their stretcher, out the door they went, they put her in the back of the ambulance, and they sped off to the local hospital. As Dr. Marsden watched the ambulance disappear down the road, he knew his patient was now in good hands, but he was still very shaken by the whole experience. Because this type of emergency, somebody going into unexplained sudden cardiac arrest following a totally routine surgery, was extremely rare. Meaning, for this to happen even just once over the course of somebody's medical career, to have witnessed something like that, was very rare. But for Dr. Marsden, this was not the first time he had seen this. In fact, literally the day before, a different patient at the Surgicare Center had also gone into sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest following their routine procedure. So, as Dr. Marsden went back inside and began heading upstairs to the hospital administrator's office to tell them about this latest emergency, he kept thinking to himself how crazy it was that he had just witnessed these two unexplained sudden cardiac arrests basically back to back. But Dr. Marsden just thought to himself, hopefully this is just a really bad coincidence. The Surgicare Center's administrator was a woman named Ashley Burks, and when she heard about this second unexplained cardiac arrest, she knew she had to call a staff meeting. And so that evening, she, along with Dr. Marsden and over 24 other medical staff, doctors, nurses, other anesthesiologists, they met in this conference room in the back of the building. And once everybody was assembled, Ashley began by updating everyone on the two patients who had been rushed off to the hospital for their cardiac emergencies, and she said they had stabilized and they'd be okay. But Ashley then said what everybody in the room was thinking, which is sudden unexplained cardiac arrest is so rare, we can't just treat these things like coincidence. Like something specifically must have caused these incidents, and we need to figure out what that thing was. Now, it was possible that the cause or causes behind these incidents were quite simple. Ashley said to the group, the first thing she did was she looked at the two patients' files to see if they had specific drug allergies or medical risk factors that might have been overlooked by staff. But when she looked at their files, neither patient had those risk factors or allergies, so that couldn't have been it. Ashley said she also looked for just a common thread between these two incidents. Like, were the patients doing something similar? Were they in for similar reasons? Were they in the same room? But no, they were in different operating rooms, going through different procedures with different medical teams. And so there was no obvious common thread between the two incidents. So Ashley said to the group that the only reasonable explanation that she could think of, at least at this point, was that perhaps the equipment in the Surgicare Center had malfunctioned. And so what she was going to do, out of an abundance of caution, was just begin testing all of the equipment in the building. And so Ashley told the group that in the meantime, while she was doing that, the rest of the staff should be extra attentive to their patients and also be on the lookout for potential problems with hospital equipment. Ashley watched the medical staff all nod their heads in agreement and begin sort of talking to each other, and then she thanked them all for being there and told them they could leave. 3 weeks later, on the afternoon of June 22nd, Ashley stood outside the OR in the hallway, looking through a cabinet that contained surgical drugs. Ashley was still trying to find a connection between those two sudden cardiac arrests. She'd already checked all the Surgicare Center's equipment, from the anesthesia machines to the vital sign monitors to the breathing tubes, and everything was in perfect working condition. And so now, checking these drugs inside of this cabinet was sort of like her last resort. She'd printed out a list of recent drug recalls and was now comparing that list against all of the drugs inside of this cabinet. And so one by one, she was reading a drug and checking the date on it and comparing it with her list to make sure, they were not carrying recalled drugs still. But after going through dozens and dozens of bottles, there was nothing in their cabinet that was on the recall list. So Ashley still just did not have an answer for why those two cardiac emergencies had happened. However, since that staff meeting 3 weeks earlier, the Surgicare Center had not had another cardiac emergency. And so Ashley was thinking to herself, maybe, despite not knowing how this happened, these troubles are in the past. Ashley shut the drug cabinet and walked down the hallway towards the break room to grab her lunch. But the moment she walked inside, she saw a group of her colleagues sitting around a table looking very upset. In fact, some people were visibly crying. And so Ashley walked up to them and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And a nurse told her that one of their colleagues, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Melanie Kaspar, was dead. Apparently, the night before, she had had a heart attack at her home, and her husband had found her and called 911, but unfortunately, by the time paramedics arrived, she was already deceased. Ashley was shocked. She knew Dr. Kaspar, and she knew she was in great shape. She was only in her mid-50s. She did not seem like someone who might just randomly have a heart attack. But then also Ashley began to think that she remembered hearing in the last few days that Dr. Kaspar had actually been feeling sick. And so she wondered if maybe whatever illness she was suffering from had something to do with her heart attack. Either way, as the Surgicare administrator, it was Ashley's job to plan staff events like memorial services. And so Ashley told the group, hey, I'll get to work putting together a small ceremony for Dr. Kaspar. 5 days later, on June 27th, Ashley was sitting in front of her office computer ordering supplies for Dr. Kaspar's memorial when suddenly she heard these loud, fast footsteps out in the hall as if somebody was sprinting towards her office. And then a moment later, Ashley saw her door burst open and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Chad Marsden, was standing there and he looked absolutely horrified and he just said to her, "It's happening again." Ashley's stomach dropped, and she jumped up and sprinted after Dr. Marsden, and they made their way to the hallway outside of the OR. And when they got there, Ashley immediately heard the sound of that long single beep of somebody's heart monitor flatlining, and she looked over and she saw one of the doors to an operating room was open, and inside she saw a surgeon performing chest compressions on an elderly patient. And even from out in the hall, Ashley could tell this man was unconscious, his skin was gray, and he was foaming at the mouth. It was exactly like the other cardiac emergencies that had happened before. Except this time was worse, because that beep, that flatlining beep, meant that this man's heart had actually stopped. And so Ashley just stood there in horror, watching the surgeon perform these chest compressions, knowing that if that didn't work, if they couldn't get this man's heart started again, he was about to die. Just then, Ashley heard the sound of the doors leading into the OR hallway open, and these two paramedics came rushing inside, and right as they passed her and got to the doorway leading into where this man was basically dying, Ashley heard the sound of the flatline beep turn into regular beeping, which meant the surgeon who was doing chest compressions had managed to restart this man's heart. And so Ashley was relieved, but by no means thought they're out of the woods yet. This man clearly is going through a medical emergency here. But the paramedics got the man off the OR table, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him away. And so once they were gone, Ashley, Dr. Marsden, and the surgeon who'd been doing the chest compressions, they all just looked at each other like, what is going on here? Clearly, there is something causing all these sudden cardiac arrests, but still nobody knew what it was. Ashley just stood there for a moment, feeling absolutely sick to her stomach. If it wasn't the drugs, and if it wasn't the medical equipment that caused these sudden cardiac arrests, then what was it? Well, Ashley was determined to find out. Just a reminder, my very first book, MrBallen Presents Strange, Dark, and Mysterious, The Graphic Stories, is out right now and shipping worldwide. You can find it wherever books or audiobooks are sold. This book is truly a brand new experience for anybody who's a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious. You've never had a book before, so this is a big deal. It's a collection of 9 stories. Some are new, some are old, but they're all awesome. The artwork is incredible. The storytelling is just superb. So if you have not purchased your copy yet, or you haven't bought it for one of your friends yet, come on, go to book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books are sold and get a copy today. Again, that is book.ballenstudios.com or go to wherever books or audiobooks are sold to get your copy of our first book today. Over the next 2 months, Ashley interviewed and observed every single employee of the Surge Care Center to make sure they really were following their protocol absolutely to a T. And one after another, through her research, she discovered that they all were. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. So the cardiac arrests could not be chalked up to faulty equipment, recalled drugs, or human error. And yet, the cardiac emergencies kept on happening at the Surge Care Center. There were 3 incidents in July and 4 more incidents in the first 3 weeks of August. And so in total, that made 10 patients at the Surge Care Center who had all gone into sudden unexplained cardiac arrest. Now, none of them had died, but Ashley knew a few of them had been left with permanent heart damage. People were getting seriously injured on her watch. And she felt like, she can't figure out what's going on here. And so it's just a matter of time until somebody does die from one of these cardiac emergencies. And so she was feeling completely overwhelmed and stressed out and desperate until August 24th, when 2 things happened in quick succession. First, in the morning of August 24th, Ashley received a phone call from an officer at the Dallas Police Department. And they told her that the autopsy had been completed on Dr. Melanie Kaspar, the anesthesiologist who had died back in June from a heart attack at her home. And this police officer thought that Ashley really needed to know that her heart attack had not been natural. It was actually caused by an overdose of a drug called bupivacaine. So Ashley knew what bupivacaine was. It was a drug that was basically only used in surgical anesthesia. But Ashley had never heard of anybody abusing this drug or overdosing on it, because bupivacaine does not make you high like morphine or fentanyl does. It's closer to Novocaine. It's like a numbing agent. And so Ashley told the officer how weird it was, the idea that she had died of an overdose of bupivacaine of all drugs. And the officer agreed with her. But regardless, he thought Ashley should know because he thought it was possible that Dr. Kaspar had gotten the bupivacaine from the Surge Care Center. And so feeling totally confused, Ashley thanked the officer for telling her, then they hung up, and then Ashley walked to the OR hallway to check the drug cabinet where drugs like bupivacaine were stored. But as soon as she entered that hallway, the second thing happened that day. Ashley heard chaos break out inside of an operating room where she knew an 18-year-old boy was undergoing what should have been a routine sinus surgery. And so she watched helplessly as the doors flung open and a nurse came running out into the hall to call an ambulance. And then inside the room, Ashley saw an anesthesiologist performing chest compressions on this boy, and another doctor was administering oxygen and blood pressure medication. It was the same nightmare playing out now for an 11th time. But this time, after the EMTs wheeled this boy away to be driven off to the local hospital, Ashley was so desperate to figure out what was going on here that she just couldn't wait. And so she rounded up a couple of hospital staffers that were nearby, and they went into that operating room and they checked the medical equipment, they checked the drugs that had been used, they searched the floor for anything that might have had something to do with this. I mean, they even searched the trash can. And in the trash, Ashley found something that the second she saw it, it made her blood run cold. She couldn't believe somebody would do something this awful, or why they would do this. And so she took the thing she found in the trash and she ran out of the operating room and upstairs to call the police. Minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at the Surge Care Center and they saw what Ashley had found in the trash. And when they looked at it, they knew they had a very serious situation on their hands. And so right away, they roped off the operating room where this 18-year-old boy had been, and they began looking for evidence inside of there. And then also, they began reviewing the security camera footage from the OR hallway. And as they reviewed this footage, they would find something truly chilling going on in that hallway that totally explained all of the sudden cardiac arrests that had been happening inside the Surgicare Center. This is what they saw on the clearest piece of footage, which was shot 5 days earlier on August 19th. A hospital employee is seen walking down the OR hallway carrying a stack of papers under his arm. He walks past a couple of his colleagues and he arrives in front of this big metallic device that sort of looks like a refrigerator, and he opens it up and he reaches inside and he pulls out a saline IV bag. Now, when he does this, nobody else in the hallway bats an eye because this is a totally normal thing to do. That metal device was a warming machine where saline IV bags were stored to be used during or after surgeries. At any given point, this warmer would contain a few dozen IV bags, and whenever it got low, certain staff members would restock it. But the police watched this footage over and over again, and they saw this employee who walks up to the warmer was not just carrying a stack of papers. He was also hiding something within those papers, his own saline IV bag. And so before this man takes out an IV bag from the warmer, he takes this hidden one and places it in the warmer as well. So he's basically swapped one for one. And this was absolutely bizarre because it was not his job to be restocking the warmer. He shouldn't have been putting anything inside of the warmer. And so about 30 minutes after this employee has placed his own IV bag inside of the warmer, a nurse comes out of the OR, walks down the hallway, opens up the warmer, takes one of the warmed up IV bags, carries it down the hall, goes back into the OR, and minutes later, her patient goes into cardiac arrest. It would turn out that nurse had inadvertently grabbed the saline bag that the male employee had secretly placed just minutes before. And she didn't know that that saline bag is what caused the cardiac arrest. Nobody knew until days later when Ashley is so desperate to figure out why all these patients are going into cardiac arrest that she began searching through the trash, and she would find an empty IV bag, and she would see very clearly there was a little puncture on it, just big enough for a needle. And so after seeing this security footage, the police analyzed that empty IV bag that Ashley had found in the trash with the puncture on it to see exactly what was in that IV that went into the 18-year-old who also went into cardiac arrest. And inside, they found a combination of 3 drugs that when combined are like a biological bomb that will send somebody into cardiac arrest within minutes. They were lidocaine, which is an anesthetic, epinephrine, which is basically pure adrenaline, and crucially, the third drug found was bupivacaine, the anesthetic that Dr. Melanie Kaspar had overdosed on, which caused her to die of a heart attack. And this discovery meant that Dr. Kaspar's death was almost certainly connected to these poisoned IV bags. In the few days before Dr. Kaspar's death, she had been feeling sick and dehydrated. And on the day of her death, she was feeling so unwell at work that, unbeknownst to any of her colleagues, she had taken a saline IV bag from that warmer and brought it home with her to rehydrate herself. But unfortunately, the one that she grabbed was one of the poisoned ones. When paramedics arrived at Dr. Kaspar's home, they found her still with the IV needle in her arm. But at the time, nobody connected her death with all of the cardiac emergencies at the Surgicare Center. Well, nobody except for the employee who was actually poisoning the IV bags. That employee was an anesthesiologist, but it was not Dr. Chad Marsden. It was the person that Dr. Marsden had to get out of the way for in the hallway that first time his patient had gone into cardiac arrest. The man who was doing the tampering was Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz. He was 58 years old, and he had only worked at the Surgicare Center for about a year. And he had flown mostly under the radar there until May 19th of 2022, which was about a week before the sudden unexplained cardiac arrests had begun at the Surgicare Center. On that day, on May 19th, Dr. Ortiz had allowed one of his patients to stop breathing, nearly killing the patient. And so as a result of that incident, Dr. Ortiz had been placed under internal investigation by the Surgicare Center, and he was facing the possibility of losing his medical license because of negligence. So to try to avoid losing his medical license, Dr. Ortiz decided he would just try to make all the other doctors look negligent too, taking the attention off of himself. And so he began sabotaging his colleagues' surgeries by injecting those drugs into their patients' IV bags, knowing it would cause cardiac arrest. Now, none of the patients who went into cardiac arrest at the Surgicare Center died. However, Dr. Kaspar, who took that tampered IV bag home with her, did die. And so ultimately, Dr. Ortiz was responsible for her death. In April of 2024, Dr. Ortiz was found guilty on multiple charges, and he is currently facing a sentence of up to 190 years in prison. If you don't know this, late last year, we launched a brand new, strange, dark, and mysterious show called MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. And so far, people love it. It is a free weekly show where each week we explore a new, baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape: our own bodies. Topics discussed on the show range from obscure diseases and freak occurrences to totally weird medical mishaps that sometimes result in big, amazing discoveries, and other times result in just unimaginable suffering and death. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, then you really ought to give MrBallen's Medical Mysteries a try. To start listening, go look up and follow MrBallen's Medical Mysteries on any podcast platform, and boom, you're in. You got yourself a new weekly show. But if you're super impatient, like I am, and you can't wait a whole week to get a new episode, well, with your Prime membership, you can listen to an entire batch of 8 episodes at once, because we release them 8 at a time on Amazon Music. Also, on Amazon Music, there are no ads. And if all this was not enough to sell you on maybe giving the show a try, I'll play you a sneak peek from our newest episode of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. Enjoy. A man in his 40s was sitting in a cafe, munching on a ham and cheese sandwich for lunch. Now, usually, the man had more lavish lunches, but today he was in a hurry to get back to work, and this was all the cafe offered. But then, the most wonderful smell filled the air. The man inhaled deeply, enjoying the heavenly aroma of whatever this food was. It smelled like this incredible hot dish. He looked around to see which table the smell was coming from, but as he scanned the restaurant, all he saw were other patrons eating basically simple sandwiches just like him. And then he remembered, this cafe didn't even serve hot meals. But at the same time, he realized he knew that scent from his childhood. It was the smell of the delicious Spanish fried eggs that his mother used to make, called huevos rotos. This was not the man's first phantom smell. A few weeks ago, his apartment had filled with the amazing aroma of his mother's cooking, completely out of nowhere. But now, in this cafe, just like that time in his apartment, the sweet smell suddenly turned sour. The man could taste something metallic in his mouth, and the foul odor of sour milk lingered in the air, making him gag. And so suddenly, a wave of panic crept over the man. He didn't know why he kept smelling things that weren't there.